So the second video on economic growth will look at the factors that the economic growth of a country depends on. Now the factors can be classified as fundamentally the factors of production of the economy, which are 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. It is these factors of production that decide or determine to what extent the economic growth of a country depends on. Now, obviously, this is not black and white as it seems, as nothing in econ is, because we can see some things which are very contradictory to what we are studying. But we'll look at this as the base, and then later on when we go into development economics and look at the difference between economic growth and development, and look at why some countries which do have these factors of production but are not growing or are not developing in the way that they should, that's the topic for economic development, when we start that area of the syllabus. But for now, continuing on what we spoke about in the last video about short-term economic growth and long-term economic growth, this particular video will focus on the long-term, because the short-term economic growth is the increase in the real GDP for 2 consecutive quarters. So that depends on the real GDP, as we know. The components of it, the 4 components, are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, C plus I plus G plus XN. Whereas here we are looking at the long-term economic growth because we are focusing on the potential GDP. When it comes to the factors of production and the land, labor, capital, and enterprise, and all of these points that are written in black, all of them are connected to these. So even though the points look like they are so many, they're actually really easy to remember because we can connect them to these factors of production. So the first one is a factor endowments. Now, factor endowments is the resources or the factors of production, the resources in terms of land especially, and what you get out of land that economies have been endowed with. So for example, the United States and Saudi have been endowed with a lot of oil, and oil is a major resource. It's a major factor of production, and this means that their economies growth has a lot to do with the fact that they have oil. Another case in point is Australia, which produces a lot of like coal, gold, iron ore. All of these factors are there, or these resources rather are there in Australia. Another example would be Africa, but again, like I said, Africa is a case study in having a lot of resources and not actually growing, which we will look at later on, something called the resource curse. But in the case over here, when we talk about factor endowments, these are good examples that you can give. In connection with that, the next point is the discovery of resources like oil and other tradable commodities. Right? These discoveries, if you discover oil, so I'm talking about post 2000 rather. Like in Kazakhstan, there was a discovery of oil, one of the big large oil basins, which actually puts Kazakhstan as one of the countries which has a lot of oil, and its economy is largely dependent on it. And the same for Brazil in 2017. There's a big large reserve found. I don't remember the name, but you can look that up. So what happens is that this can actually increase the potential output of the country, because it can possibly shift the PPC outwards. Now the PPC can shift outwards when we talk about an increase in the quantity and or the quality of the factors of production. So in this case, the factor of production is the raw material oil, and this can actually push the PPC outward. Okay, so that's the factor of production, land. The next factor of production is labor. Now, if you can see, there are a lot of points over here. Point number 3 and 5 and 7 and 8. They all deal with labor. So which shows you the importance of labor as a factor of production when it comes to economic growth. When we talk about the size and skills of the labor force, we should know what's the definition of the labor force. So labor force is nothing but the unemployed plus the employed of a country, which means that all of those who are actually employed, who are earning money in the economy, and all of those that are actively seeking work, who are of employable age but they have not yet got work. So the unemployed plus the employed consists of the country's labor force. Now, the size of the labor force really matters, because if the labor force, is large in an economy, it means that there are lesser dependents and more people earning money. But again, putting that into context, if we look at countries like China and India, yes, their size of labor force is large, which has into a large part led to rapid economic growth. But on the other hand, the population is also very large. So to put that in context, you should really see what is the percentage of their labor force in percentage to their population, and how much does that actually contribute to their GDP. So yes, definitely for China and India, we can say that the size of their labor force is very large, in part because of the large population. There is, in fact, there's a large part of the labor force which would probably not be as skilled, or probably not be as qualified. And then there's a part which is very skilled and very qualified. So you have both the kinds, because there are people who are very poor and lots of members in the family, and then they have been pushed into working from a very small age, and that again increases the size of the labor force. Another point is the skills of the labor force. So Germany is a good example for that, which have a very skilled labor force, which again has led to their economic growth. One thing to remember is that if the growth is there in the size of the working population, that would again push the country towards growing economically. So that can happen in two ways. If the birth rate is greater than the death rate, then the size of the working population increases. And secondly, if there is a net immigration. So net immigration means the difference between immigrants versus emigrants, the people who are coming into the country versus the people who are going out. So we can take an example of Canada over here. Their net immigration is pretty high, and almost everyone who immigrates to Canada would take up some form of work, which would again increase their labor force size and skills both. So that would again lead to economic growth. The next point in relation to labor as a factor of production can be division of labor and specialization. Now, division of labor and specialization means dividing them into specific tasks. So dividing labor based on the task, the skills that they have, or the things that they are good at that they can do in a lesser amount of time, which will make them efficient and it will reduce wastage. So that machines, if they are used and when they are used, can be used for specific tasks which the labor is not used for. That can again lead to a rapid economic growth. Another one is labor productivity, which is related to division of labor and specialization, because if there is division of labor, that leads to labor productivity, and the labor becomes that much more productive. There are very interdependent factors of qualifications, experiences, training, skills, and motivation that lead to a productive labor force. And if these things are provided, then that would lead to sustained economic growth. Another point is mobility of labor. Now, this is an important point because economic growth, like we spoke about Canada having a lot of immigrants, and the net immigration would lead to their economic growth. So which means that the people who have gone to Canada were actually geographically mobile, right? They were geographically mobile, means they could move from where they were born, or where they were working initially, or where they were educated, to a place where there was more opportunity. And because of that, that leads to economic growth of the country. Now, this is a very important point because it's sometimes difficult for labor to do that. So I'm an international teacher. I have moved many countries depending on opportunity, depending on circumstances and things like that. But there are a lot of people who would probably not be able to do that. And then that will lead to economic growth not really happening for some countries which don't have those opportunities. So that's a good point to take into consideration here, how much of that is actually possible. Another type of mobility of labor is occupational. Occupational is basically changing jobs. So if in a particular economy or in a country, there are people who are able to change their jobs because they are given that kind of support in terms of training or qualifications in probably a lesser time, and they are equipped with skills and motivated for that. So economies which help out with this would obviously have a more occupationally mobile workforce, or even geographically mobile workforce for that matter. And that leads to economic growth because every economy undergoes structural changes, where it changes over time. There could be introduction of things like new technology. So for that new technology, you would need workforce that can actually keep up with that, and that leads to economic growth. So that's all about labor as a factor of production. Capital and enterprise, I think we look at capital next, which is investment expenditure. So for any economy, it is very important that there is investment. And investment into what? Investment into capital goods, because capital goods are the ones that are making the consumer goods. So if there aren't enough capital goods, then it is very difficult for the economy to actually grow over time, right? If the economy is just consumer goods driven, it will be very difficult for the economy to sustain, which is why made in America is like the new buzzword when Donald Trump had taken charge, because a lot of production was taking place outside the US, and the US actually had to import a lot of goods, consumer goods were made but not capital goods. So the production, the manufacturing sector was not there. And capital goods are a very, very important part of the economy sustaining growth. And new technology is again very important because if the labor is specialized into certain tasks, and you have new technology which can take up a part of the task, the productivity would go up. Again, that would lead to economic growth, and new technology would make things more efficient and probably make less wastage, saving time and energy, and all of that would again lead to economic growth. So these are some of the factors. I'm sure you could add some more, but this is a pretty comprehensive view of all the factors of production. Enterprise is again something that would come in even over here and here. And even when we talk about new production methods, sorry, I skipped this out. This would probably be a good one for enterprise. So in the 1980s, there was the concept of teamwork came about in the assembly lines and making motor vehicles, where people were actually specialized, and tasks were made, and teams were made for particular tasks that again drove up efficiency. This is a good example of enterprise as a factor of production. So if you have new production methods, this would mean that the potential output can increase because of the increase in efficiency. So again, this leads to economic growth. Right? So I think we've covered up pretty much all of the factors of production that can lead to economic growth. These are important points in terms of, remembering why economic growth. And this can come in the form of an essay, like a 10-mark essay describe or explain point in the IB syllabus. So it's pretty important to know these points. In the last and final video, we'll look at short-term and long-term economic growth in terms of diagrams. We'll look at the PPC, which we have spoken about over here, and we'll also look at the AD-AS diagram. Thank you.